All right, so this is one of my favorite talks because it gives a really necessary and interesting historical detailing of our profession from the lens of a historian. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Douglas Haynes. He's the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and provides executive leadership to empower students and employees to maximize their potential in an affirmative learning and working environment at UCI. Through the Office of Inclusive Excellence, he leads a team of inclusive excellence champions to advance institutional transformation. To this end, OIE, as it's called, drives accountability through data-driven metrics, mounts a suite of capacity-building courses and training modules, engages in research and evidence-based practices to promote a thriving organization, and leverages external partnerships to accelerate change at UCI and throughout the University of California. Welcome, Dr. Haynes.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and welcome to all of you. And I really appreciate your participation in this seminar series. What I'd like to do today is provide an overview of American medicine. All of you are involved in your professional education and training, and often it's easy to imagine and understand the contours of career in terms of your present experience. And what I hope to sort of achieve in this presentation is really to describe the key institutions in the making of modern medicine. And I want to do that because, as I'll show, the making of modern American medicine as we know it today was very much driven in relationship to categories of race and gender. In other words, these categories define the boundaries of who could be a healer and who could not be a healer, who was an object of study and who was an agent of medicine. We also want to do another thing, in addition to looking at the use of race and gender in constructing of the medical profession, but also to analyze changing continuity in who is a medical graduate, because you have to be a medical graduate in order to become a doctor. And so in some sense, the ongoing discussion that we're having this year, we've had in previous years, why are there so few Black doctors, for example? And why do we pay attention to the fact that, at least for the past 5 years, in the graduate student population, women have been half of the student population, but less than 25% of medical school faculty? And so, if you don't mind, could you advance that slide? And so I want to start with a painting, because what's important to remember about social organizations like professions, even the profession that we're learning to join, is that there's founding myths, origin stories. And so this particular painting is a depiction of the first meeting of what would become the American Medical Association in 1847 in Philadelphia. And this is a painting that was actually executed in 1961. But when you look at this painting, it's conveying and communicating the aspirations of this group of founding, quote unquote, fathers of American medicine, and in particular the AMA. And when you look out, they are meeting at the Natural History Museum in Philadelphia. And in meeting there, they're communicating that medicine is very much a part of the landscape of science. If you look a little closer at how they comport themselves and how they're dressed in the quintessential middle-class garb of the bourgeoisie. And so in how they dress, they're communicating their social aspiration of being a part of the middle class as distinct from the laboring poor or the working poor. And it may seem obvious, but it's noteworthy, if you can go back one more time, that they're all male and all white. And so it's just as the staging is very deliberate in 1847, just as people's clothing is very deliberate in 1847, so is the fact that there are no women and no Black people in this audience of the founding members of what would become the American Medical Association, right? And so the question we ask is why? And so if you can advance the next slide, I want to look at another founding story, an origin story. And this is one that many of us are familiar with. This is the painting that captures the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And so in some sense, again, it's a representation in terms of how these individuals wanted to be seen. And in some sense, they wanted to be seen as representatives of the new nation. They dress in the garb of well-to-do property-owning men. And not a small number of these property-owning men own slaves. And to sort of indicate that they're not simply revolutionaries, but also they have a connection to the past. If you look at the architectural features behind them, you'll see the sort of Greek motifs that connect them to the sort of the cradle of democracy in ancient Greece. Again, this is an origin story that is seeking to sort of describe the invention of something, right? Next slide. And so what's so striking when we think about that painting by Edward, that painting of the meaning of the AMA in 1847, they're meeting in the Natural Science Museum in this calm, very deliberative meeting, but actually the context is totally different. The first half of the 19th century, basically from 1800 to 1850, there was a social crisis about medicine that essentially was about deciding who gets to heal and who is a legitimate healer. And what's driving this crisis was the proliferation of medical schools. Unlike today, there was no equivalent of the American Association of Medical Colleges, right? And so effectively, because of the proliferation of medical schools, truly anyone could be a healer or call themselves a doctor. Indeed, being a doctor was not a legal title that was exclusive to people with approved degrees. Right? What we also see during this period leading up to that meeting of the original founding of the AMA in 1847 is that there was competition between two different types of healers. There are those who are known as regular healers, those who simply engaged in intervening in the body through surgery. Then there were the irregular practitioners who really looked at the body as an object that you wanted to keep in balance, right? Through the various sort of organ systems. And their practice was not to cut open the body, but to regulate the body. Also, there's two other developments that are taking place at this time that add to the sense of crisis, is that many states at that time passed legislation that either diluted or abolished laws that privileged doctors. And that would mean, for example, that only doctors could serve on juries or be excused from jury service. It's just one example, right? And finally, there are many states that still were joining the Union about the 1850s where there was no regulation, right? And so it's out of this context that regular doctors decided to come together to organize. Next slide. And what they attempted to organize would become the contours of American medicine. So by creating organizations, they were seeking to define, right, who was part of the medical community. And they did that not with the sort of authority of the state, but by creating associations, right? And by creating associations, they were able to regulate membership, right? They were able to regulate who was a member of the competent based on their participation in the organization, right? And this also, the creation of this community of the competent effectively created the boundaries of organized medicine. These associations, which would grow across the United States, certainly in the first half of the 19th century, provided not just a space for fellowship, for bringing like-minded people together to distinguish themselves from other types of healers. It also provided a platform for articulating the value of regular medicine, for promoting the idea that regular doctors are the authentic healers of society. And they were able to distinguish themselves from other types of healers. And so it's out of this social crisis that I outlined, together with the growth of these state-based associations, that lay the foundation for that meeting in 1847 that would create the American Medical Association, right? And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that these are choices. These are political choices to create these associations. But I next want to look at the social consequences of those choices. And so in 1847, with the establishment of the AMA, they created not simply a state, but a national organization by bringing together these various state-based associations, right? And in doing that, they created a set of elected leaders. They selected meeting venues. And in both of these cases of electing officers like the president and selecting meeting venues, uppermost in their mind was to create a national organization by literally meeting in different parts of the country, as well as by having different leaders who reflected the different regions of the country. Right? This also helped to foster what I call a corporate idiom, right? So even though we met in New York or we met in Chicago, we all were part of the American Medical Association. We were part of a community of the competent. And part of the corporate idiom that would grow was that regular practitioners are agents of progress. And indeed, they represent a source of national culture, right? The way in which the AMA define and police the contours of American medicine was primarily through persuasion and consensus. And it's important to remember that regular practitioners that form the majority of the AMA really lacked a reliable therapeutic toolkit, right? They didn't have access to sulfa drugs that became common after World War II. Even the use of anesthesia was fairly unusual until the last quarter of the 19th century, right? And again, as I mentioned earlier, there were so many medical schools that were largely unregulated, right? That no one in their right mind could necessarily speak on behalf of all doctors. And so it's within this organization, the AMA, that these doctors together begin to form a consensus, right? Particularly about medical education and the code of conduct. And they rely again on persuasion and consensus, right? In other words, when they looked at medical education or the code of ethics, they simply didn't inherit something that was already fixed. They had to politically construct something. Finally, the last component of this national meeting is that's at these annual meetings that would draw people from across the country to be in fellowship and community to create this national organization. For the most part, that was the AMA. That was the business of the AMA, was to organize, mount, and support one national meeting. There was no salaried staff of the American Medical Association. There was no regular journal. If you look at the AMA today, it's one of the most influential professional organizations in the country. And if anything, it has a vast organization that's supported by staff. It has multiple journals. It collects dues. It engages in advocacy. And so the AMA of 1847 is radically different from the AMA of 2021, but it's the origins of the present AMA. Next slide. And so I want to describe the locations and the presence, because again, you'll notice that when you look at the states that represents the different presidents, that it really reflects many states at that time in the United States. They are presidents from northern states, presidents from Midwestern states, and presidents from southern states. And so in some sense, that's by design to create a national organization that represents the relevant regions of the country. Next slide. Now, here is a detail of that list I just showed. It's about 14 meetings that took place between 1847 and 1860. And 1861 was the outbreak of the Civil War. That is the war that would last roughly 5 years, that was about defending the right of states to legally own and sell enslaved Black people. Right? Now, I want you to take a look at this detail, because you'll see on the left column all the northern states that represent the residency of AMA presidents. If you look to the right, you'll see an equal number of the states of residency of AMA presidents. And of course, in the final column, you'll see 2 states that represents the residence of at least 2 presidents of the AMA. The reason why I'm sort of focusing on this is that what this shows is that in the creation of American medicine through the AMA, American medicine coexisted with the existence of slavery, right? That there was no boundary when it comes to the American Medical Association, that you can both aspire to create a new standard of medicine at the time when nearly 5 million people were legally enslaved in the United States, right? Another way of thinking about that is that first slide I showed you in 1847. And what that slide doesn't show is the implication, the complicity of the AMA in American slavery, at least through where they met for their national meetings, at least the states of residencies of the presidents. And in subsequent slides, we'll see how language about Black people was consistent with a pro-slavery viewpoint, not to mention a general racist view of Black people. And again, this sort of describes how the making of American medicine over the course of the 19th century not only was built in relationship to slavery and anti-Black racism, but was enabled by it. And so if you advance the next slide, I want to sort of describe some of the features of these annual meetings. And again, the annual meeting was essentially the only sort of work of the AMA. They didn't have a salaried staff, they didn't have journals, but they would spend most of their time doing the business of American medicine at these annual meetings. And again, what's striking is that 5 out of the 14 antebellum, that means before the Civil War meetings, were in slave states, right? What we found when we looked at the transactions of these meetings is that in the research meetings or research panels of these meetings, it wasn't uncommon for Black people to be portrayed as different from white people, as well as research being used in the service of defending slavery. Now, another aspect of these annual meetings is that women did not attend as doctors. In fact, for the most part, for most of the 19th century, women weren't members of the AMA. For the most part, women attended as dependents of male practitioners. Furthermore, in the Code of Ethics, what's striking is it's conveyed in the various categories of the code that women are subordinate to males. And finally, we also see that it is presumed that doctors, male doctors, have authority over women's bodies, right? And so by describing the sort of characteristics of the AMA at their primary activity, the annual meeting, what I'm trying to show is that American medicine coexisted with slavery. It coexisted with patriarchy as well. Next slide. And so I want to take I've lifted several quotations from various reports that were delivered at these annual meetings. And I'm doing that just to illustrate how the rhetoric, or rather the discourse of these meetings sort of reinforced, if not outwardly defended, the institution of slavery or the inferiority of Black people. And so in this one report on the health status of slaves, it really conveys a pro-slavery posture by saying, so far as health and longevity are concerned, the slaves in the slaveholding states are in a better condition than that class of any nation most clearly assimilated to them in social position. And so in other words, this report is saying that actually slavery produces comparatively good health in enslaved Black people. And furthermore, this slave also talks about why, to the extent that there is differential illness or health status, it's the fault of slaves. Here, the quotation reads, "Certain it is our slaves are very much disposed to roam about at night, frequently staying home until a short time before day, thus sleeping little, and that little sleeping up or lying upon a floor without covering." Okay. Next slide, please. Now, these next selections are taken from the 19th century AMA Code of Ethics. And again, you'll recall the 2 slides ago, I talked about how even the Code of Conduct had embedded in it patriarchal views. And patriarchal refers to the organization of a social system where males are positioned as superior based on the subordination of women to them. Right? And so in the first quotation from 1857, it reads, all practitioners of medicine, their wives and children are entitled to free service of any one or more of the faculty residing near them whose assistance may be desired. Right? And so at this time, there was tremendous resistance to doctors giving free medicine, right? The exception was in providing assistance to their wives who were deemed as dependents. The second quotation really conveys more directly the patriarchal views in relationship to who is a healer and who isn't. And so in the Code of Ethics, it says patients enjoin not to consult with self-constituted doctors and doctresses who are frequently met with and who pretend to possess infallible remedies of the cure of every disease. And so what the Code of Conduct is describing not only how doctors should comport themselves, but also who is a doctor, who can heal, right? And again, this is part of an effort to define the community of the competent by defining who wasn't competent as much by who is competent. Next slide. And this selection from a report on criminal abortion in 1859 is very explicit in insisting that the medical profession has authority not only over the female body, but even the fetus. In questions of abstract rights, the medical profession does not acknowledge such words as expediency, time, service, cowardice. We are the physical guardians of women. We alone thus far of their offspring in utero. The case is here of life or death, the life or death of thousands of dependents almost wholly upon themselves. Right? So here's another example of how how defining authority is a function of asserting it over people, not based on their therapeutic capacity to heal people, right? And so in other words, part of the authority of the American medical doctor at this time had less to do with their education necessarily, or even their capacity to heal people, right? But rather by taking advantage of the existing social systems that help to reinforce their authority. Those systems included slavery, right? Where they could really use the bodies of Black people as sites of medical intervention. Similarly, the use of women's bodies as sites of medical intervention by relying on the assumption that women did not control their bodies. Right? Next slide. This is a statement that is fairly explicit. It's a report of the Committee on Medical Ethics in 1868. And it really, emerges in the context of women's rights for the vote, right? And here's another example of the American Medical Association really taking a public position in order to consolidate their authority as healers. And so in this case, it says, if the association does not adopt this view, It ought for consistently sake forthwith to publish an explanatory amendment to its code and to declare explicitly that its ethics do not include mankind, but only men. In other words, the association of learned and beloved men should forthwith stultify itself by declaring that however learned, however skilled in art, however virtuous a person may be, if that person be a woman and claims to practice medicine, we as a body will have nothing to do with her. Next slide. And so I want to sort of provide some summary points at this stage in the presentation, that when we look at the formation of the AMA beginning in 1847 and continued through the Civil War, it is partly unified in the toleration of slavery. Now, there may be doctors who participated in the 1847 founding meeting who were opposed to slavery. It's quite possible. But that didn't prevent them from participating in an organization that met enslaved states, that elected presidents who had residency in slave states, whose meetings frequently portrayed Black people as natural slaves. What's also important to remember is that during the Civil War, the AMA was one of the rare organizations, national organizations, that remained neutral. They did not adopt a position about the legitimacy of the war. It didn't criticize the Southern states. And if anything, it adopted conciliatory measures, such as considering the possibility of meeting in a Southern state that was in rebellion, communicating a desire for members of the AMA to really subordinate all else to this idea of American medicine. And as the Civil War ended, what's striking is that the rhetoric of the AMA at these annual meetings stress patriotism. Patriotism as an attribute of members of the AMA, making no distinction between the patriotism of Union doctors who served in the Union Army or doctors that served in the Confederate Army. In other words, the AMA, for all practical purposes, subordinating all else to the vision of creating a viable national organization that saw itself as the custodians of regular medicine. And finally, what's striking is that after the Civil War, in various ways, the AMA rapidly sought to promote sectional reconciliation between the North and the South. Next slide. And so, could you go back one more? And so, after the Civil War, known as the Postbellum Association, we see change in continuity, right? And so the continuity is that the AMA is still meeting around the country in former Confederate states and in northern states. It's also branching out into the West. At the same time, what's happening is that we see the establishment of new medical schools that actually are open to women of all backgrounds, as well as Black people. One of the first was Howard University. It's important to remember that Howard was unique and founded in 1868 in that it, by its charter, was opening to educate people regardless of gender or race. That was a profoundly provocative idea at that time. Now, this creates a new situation for the AMA, right? Because now you have individuals who are going to medical schools that are affiliated with universities and obtaining degrees that entitled them to be called doctors. The very existence of women with medical credentials, the very existence of Black men and women with medical credentials posed a challenge to the AMA. It posed a challenge to the AMA and its idea of American medicine because the AMA had created an image of the medical professional as white and male by its policies of exclusion as much as inclusion. And so what we begin to see in 1868, 1870, 71, 72, and 76 is a series of conflicts that take place at national meetings. The basic outline of these conflicts at national meetings really is that state associations, including District of Columbia, that had medical societies that were open to men as well as Black men and women, would seek to have their delegates accepted at the national meeting. Right? And what would happen in 1868, 77, 72, and 76 is that their credentials were rejected. Right? And the basis of the rejection of their credentials is often specious, but the underlying rationale was that if you admit them into the national meeting, you are essentially polluting the purity of American medicine. You're undermining the vision of the American doctor as white and male. And so in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after the Civil War, the AMA is struggling to both consolidate its vision of itself as representing the entire continent as the authority of regular medicine, while at the same time trying to keep women and Black men and women doctors outside of the community of the continent. Next slide. And so this is a picture of the founding faculty at Howard University. This is around 1870. Now you'll notice right off the bat, they're all male, which is true. But if you were to look at other medical faculties, let's say at Johns Hopkins, which was founded in 1886, or even at Harvard, what you would find is that their faculty were all male too. But what's particularly unusual about Howard University in comparison to all existing medical schools, whether they are affiliated with universities or not, is the presence of Black medical faculty. These two gentlemen really were the sort of the first. And what's particularly powerful is that they were peers of their other faculty members. This picture is particularly provocative because it communicates that, at least on this faculty, that there is no difference whether you are a Black faculty member or a white faculty member. That very idea challenged so much. It challenged the fundamental ideas of the American experiment, where you have a constitution that is based on slavery. It challenges the persistent ideas that Black people were inherent slaves, that they're intellectually inferior, that their bodies were different, that they lacked the capacity to learn. This faculty and their members would be a part of one of these conflicts at annual meetings, in particular the annual meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1870. their delegates did not have their credentials accepted because they did not want to have either of these gentlemen, A.A. Augustus or G.M. Palmer, socializing with other doctors from across the country within the community of the competent, which was the AMA. Next slide. Now, many of you are familiar with Samuel Gross. He is known for many innovations in American surgery. He also was a president of the AMA in 1868. Now, he's based in Pennsylvania, and that meeting took place in Philadelphia. Now, by no stretch of the imagination was Samuel Gross a product of the slave-owning South. He did not serve in the Confederacy. He was a Northerner, a highly regarded surgeon, and indeed a leader within the AMA. And yet, this is what he had to say. Next slide. Now, at this time, Samuel Gross is weighing in on the place of Black people in American society, and in particular in medicine. And this is what he would write. Now, in regard to the colored man, I love the colored man, and I sympathize with him in his bondage, but allow me to say, in saying that his masters, to my knowledge, always treated him well. I lived in a slave state for many years and never saw but 2 or 3 cases of cruelty. The Negro is now studying medicine, a delegate said yesterday, and that he would glory in associating with them. So we must someday. We must look the thing in the face, Black as it may be. But the agitation of this subject is by men who have a political interest in the matter, men who do not love the Negro half as much as I do, men who sacrifice the white man and the white women in behalf of the Negro. What has the Negro done to entitle him to recognition by the medical societies? Has he shown any capability for scientific attainment? Has he contributed anything to medical science? He is not. Next slide. Now, here's another president. This is J. Marion Sims, who would be president in 1876. And Sims is known as a pioneering gynecological surgeon, including developing new suture techniques for fistula tears. This particular painting is a depiction of some of the experiments he conducted in the 1850s to pioneer techniques to suture fistulas. And what's important to remember about Sims is that he conducted his experiments on female Black slaves. And these experiments were conducted without the aid of anesthesia, even though it was available at that time. What's important to remember about the connection to this landmark of surgical innovation is that Sims perfected it on Black women's bodies that were enslaved. After the Civil War, he would relocate to New York and become very wealthy for providing this surgical treatment to wealthy white women. There used to be a statue of him in Central Park, but it was later taken down and removed precisely because of the sort of origin of his surgical technique. Colleagues, at this time, I want to pause because I'm going to have to sort of end my remarks at 4 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, I'm afraid. But Kelly, I wanted to know if we wanted to use the remaining bit of time for any questions or comments that people may have.
We can absolutely do that. I think there was a lot covered, and a point was certainly made, right?
Yeah.
That this profession is not immune just because people come into it because they want to help people
Mhm.
from racism. Uh, if anything, it was founded on racism and
Mhm.
was strengthened by
Mhm.
exclusion. We
Mhm.
heard in Dr. Tony Aiton's talk about the narrative of exclusion in a political sense and in a sense of how we decide to distribute resources
Mhm.
and offer certain services to certain people. We heard in our session with Dr. Terrence Mays around sociocultural bias and how that plays out in a more current context. We will hear later tomorrow, from a
Mhm.
panel of physicians who occupy space in organized medicine around how organized medicine, specifically the American Medical Association, its state organizations, and specialty organizations have managed to overcome this legacy. So just know this is part of a thread within the Advanced Health Policy Elective. And I certainly encourage people to ask questions either about this historical context of the AMA or of the profession largely.
One thing I'll add is that one of the consequences of the AMA being an exclusive organization, primarily serving white men, was we see the creation of what's known as the National Medical Association, which is the foremost national medical organization for doctors of color. Originally, it was primarily focused on Black physicians because there was no equivalent national organization. And so it's important to keep this in mind to sort of, it might cause you to scratch your head. Why are there so many professional organizations? Well, there's a reason for that, right? And within the US landscape, it takes these specific professional organizations to lobby, to advocate, and to demand change. And it's important to remember the AMA was very slow to change.
Very. So in our last few minutes here, we do welcome any questions that you have for Dr. Haynes about this presentation or otherwise. But generally, I do want to thank you for being a continued speaker with us at the Advanced Health Policy Elective. I really would look forward to that discussion around dying with dignity, and the debate around that for next year, absolutely. Um,
Yeah,
but in the
yeah.
meantime, we want to thank you for being here and being nimble with us today.
Sure, sure. I want to thank you all, and I especially want to extend my thanks to you, Kelly, for inviting me. I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's a great way, I think, for all of us to sort of learn more about how we can both transform the medical profession, but it really takes knowledge. So thank you.